Hello, 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 members. It is Seamus, your head of whiskey, and I am joined by a whiskey legend, a good friend, and a man from an incredible distillery, and that distillery is Tomatin. I've got Mr. Scott Adamson. How are you, mate?
How's it going, Seamus? You well?
Very, very, very well. Unlike you, who's joining us for a dram in the morning with a little bit of jet lag, but we're very, very grateful to have you. Thank you for joining us.
It's the perfect kind of time. It's like breakfast whiskey, but also I'm about 7 hours ahead, so I'm kind of in the dream. This is perfect.
This is, I believe, what those in the having a beer while playing snooker game call the pocket. You're just
Yes,
right in there.
in the sweet zone. Yeah,
We're incredibly lucky to be joined by you because you are the man who put this little whiskey together, and I'm so excited to get into it. But for members watching along, a little bit of housekeeping. So not only do I have Scott joining us, but I'll also be very happy to pepper him with as many questions as you do have. So please hop on in the chat. We'll be choosing one of you lucky members watching along to get next month's Whiskey of the Month just for shooting us some questions, joining in. The guys in the comments are watching along. They are going to make that happen. But Scott, I mean, this is a pretty special whiskey. And for anyone who doesn't have a bottle of this, it's last month's Whiskey of the Month. I think there's maybe a few bottles left on the site right now, which is very rare at the moment to have any bottles left, but 14 years old, rum matured, incredible stuff. But mate, you're joining us. Take us through how you got to that chair.
yeah. Well, I guess my role as a whole is blender and global brand ambassador, so it's quite layered. There's a lot to it. I started at Tomatin 13 years ago now. My background, I studied Scottish history and was asked to join the distillery to research the history of the distillery, which was great. It was only meant to be here for 8 weeks, so it kind of spiraled a bit out of control. And oddly enough, I ended up working in a commercial role. So I came straight out of university studying history and was asked if I wanted to be the European sales manager. So with absolutely no history of sales, I said, yeah, I can do that job. But it was cool because Tomatin at that time, and it still is, but especially back then, it was a really, really small, close-knit team. Everyone was working across various parts of the business. So you would be doing sales, but you would also be hosting events, you would be doing tastings, you would be involved in product selection and new product development and things like that. And so pretty early on, I started nosing and tasting and writing a lot of the tasting notes for our products. And then in 2018, I was asked to become the company's brand ambassador, so move out of the direct sales role and into that more storytelling environment. And at that time, was also asked to kind of shadow Graham Unson, our master distiller, pick up a little bit of what he knows, and it just kind of built and snowballed and snowballed and snowballed. By 2021, blenders in my title, and I'm responsible for all the blended Scotch that we produce, so the Antiquary, the Big T, and stuff like that. And then again, more and more kind of responsibility came. So started looking after the limited editions, which I think is quite interesting. I think when people think of whiskey production, they think of the limited editions as the really, really cool things. But actually, from the blending point of view, they're really quite easy because all you have to do is make a really good whiskey once, because once it's gone, it's gone. The really difficult thing is core range. When you look at products like a Tomatin 12-year-old, which have been around since 1997, and you want them to taste the same every time. So I'd been working on the limited editions for a good while there, and then for the last couple of years have kind of had the responsibility for all of our bottled goods in terms of blending. So yeah, that's the role. It's kind of snowballed into this massive responsibility that I'm not entirely sure that I'm qualified for.
Come on, mate, back yourself. It's so funny that you say the limited stuff is kind of the easiest stuff because the conversations we would have with, say, your Sandy Hislops of the industry, one of the big dogs and looks after Aberlour, amongst many, many, many others, is he loves doing our limited editions because it's the one time that he just gets to faff about a bit and play with the casks that he doesn't have tens of thousands of it. Is it the same for you? It's kind of unshackled, go for a dig, find some fun stuff?
Yeah, it is. And I think when we get onto this particular whiskey, that'll really come to life. But the limited editions are really where, over the years, you'll be picking up some casks, just, you've been given an offer from a cooperage that you can't really turn down, but you've got no idea what you're going to do with these casks because you're not getting enough to make this a consistent product or an ongoing release. And then it really just becomes a case of nosing these casks every so often, and when they're ready, you can pull together a nice product and offer it to the sales and marketing team, and if they love it as much as you do, it becomes a limited edition and you get to share something really cool. I think for me, the limited editions are where we actually get to express ourselves quite a lot, and we don't have to worry so much about tradition, or not that we don't worry about them, but it doesn't have to fully fit into brand values. It can just really be a great liquid, and that's a lot of fun. So yeah, I think like Sandy would say, it's where you just get to chill out a little bit, and a lot of the time you're making a whiskey that you would like to drink yourself. So it's cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And what better spirit to be playing with? I mean, in the past, our members have gotten some pretty amazing behind the scenes looks, and I think Jamie Muir, your distillery manager, took all of the members on a virtual tour of the distillery leading up to this release. And please, if you haven't seen that video, I enormously encourage you to dig for it on our socials, dig for it on our YouTube. But it's a one-of-a-kind distillery, isn't it?
Yeah, it's pretty special. I mean, from the history point of view, the story point of view, I never get tired of talking about Tomatin because it's a distillery that for the last nearly 130 years has held a mirror up to the whiskey industry as a whole. You can pretty much tell the story of Scotch whiskey through the story of Tomatin, and that's pretty unique. So just from it being this really small kind of local Highland distiller in 1897 that struggled after the first decade, it was bought over by some whiskey blenders and, became the go-to malt whiskey for the big blends of the 20th century. And by the 1970s was the largest malt whiskey distiller in the world, but then got hit by the kind of whiskey lock of the 1980s, became the first distillery since the Second World War to enter liquidation, closed down, was repurchased by a Japanese company in the 1980s, and then it has shifted away from quantity and into quality and focusing on our own brands. The story of the distillery is amazing. What I love when you walk around the site, and you'll maybe see a little bit of it in the virtual tour, is that it's kind of like half of a working distillery and half of a museum to this massive production of the 70s. And you can walk around, and if you pay special attention, you can see where the building was extended over time and where different beams lay out and where walls were expanded and closed. And there's doors that go to nowhere, and there's windows that look onto brick walls. And it's just a really fascinatingly odd whiskey production site.
Oh, I mean, one that sticks out to me is going into the second room full of brewing vessels that's just concrete, clearly untouched by yourselves these days, and would have just been run for efficiency like a beast back in the day. So much must have changed since those 60s and 70s kind of production philosophies.
Yeah, it's mad. I mean, I once spoke to our old cooper, Ian Duffy, who he's retired now, but he still pops up onto the site every so often just to kind of bother people, which is quite cool. He just comes along for a chat. And if you've got a bit of time, he's a fountain of knowledge. And I just kind of asked him about what was production like in the 1970s. And he told me that they did 78 mashes a week, and each mash is 9 tons of malt. So we're doing that 78 times a week. And I don't know why, but in my head, I was like, why don't you just round it up to 80? And he said, we tried to, in his finest Doric accent, he was, well, we tried to, boyo. But what happened was they ran out of water and the power cut out. So, I mean, in the 1970s, we were making whiskey on the limits of what was possible. Everything was happening quickly. Let's just say quality was not the buzzword, it was efficiency, maximum efficiency, making as much whiskey as possible in as short a period of time. What's really interesting, though, is that was the birthplace of our new make spirit that we have today. Up until the 1960s, Tomatin was a lightly peated spirit. All of the whiskey made in the Highlands and Speyside up until the 1960s was peated. That was the fuel source. The market accepted it. But in the 70s, you've got North Sea oil and gas coming on board. You've got the demand from America for lighter whiskies, so the blenders don't want peated malts anymore. So although it was mass efficiency driven, that's the birthplace of what our spirit character is today. And so what's been really cool over the last, let's say, 50 years is how we've refined that. And you can taste Tomatin from the 1970s, and some of the old stuff now is just exceptional because it's just oxidized and it's become this massive tropical fruit bomb.
Yeah.
And you can see the kind of seeds of what the Tomatin spirit is today in that, and we've just refined it and refined it and refined it. I think that's one of the cool things here. You speak to Graham, our master distiller. We're definitely guided by tradition, but we're not kind of beholden to it. It's not a case of we have to do things the same way we've been doing for the last 100 years, because if you do that, you stagnate and you don't make the best whiskey. So let's take that tradition, but let's build on it and make it something really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And it seems like it's almost become a blessing to have this enormous facility to produce whiskey in. I mean, there are so many production steps that I've seen you guys taking when I visited the distillery that just seem insane. Things like pursuing 160-hour ferment times in your wash. I mean, it's not viable for other distilleries to do that, but it's got to be down to the scale and the history that you can do something like that regularly.
Yeah, I think that's a cool thing. If we were to build Tomatin today, we wouldn't build it the way that it's been built. For being honest with you, there would probably be less washbacks. There would probably be, there'd be a lot going on. But because we've still got this big site, we can kind of use it in a way that allows us to create a really cool whiskey. And the fermentation's a really good point. So we run 12 mashes a week, which means that we effectively run 12 distillations a week. And we just happen to have 12 washbacks. So that means that we can leave the wash in there for the full week. So it's a really cool thing. Again, touching on the history side, that's how whiskey was made until the 1950s. Up until the 1950s, you were not, by law, you were not allowed to brew and distill at the same time. So you would brew one week and you would distill the next. So long fermentation is a really cool part of Scotch whiskey's history that we've been able to bring back here. 168-hour fermentation, give or take. And it just creates this massive tropical bomb of a beer before we even distill it. You walk into the tun room and it smells of passion fruit. It smells of like vanilla cream. It smells of mango. It's a really, really cool thing. And yeah, we're just in a fortunate position where the site allows us to do these things.
Yeah, I have to spend a little more time on the ferments because I'm getting a few comments on it as well. I think there's a really interesting narrative in it. A lot of the industry in the last kind of 4 years has started to explore a lot of angles of going above the 100-hour, 110-hour kind of ferment time. When did you, as a distillery, start exploring it? When was it first divined as a great direction to go down?
So that actually is one of the probably shiniest silver linings of COVID. So up until the pandemic, we actually had 2 fermentation lengths. We would have, basically, the way the distillery works is we start mashing very early hours on the Monday morning, and then we will finish production on the Friday lunchtime. So we don't run 24/7. And what would happen is anything that was mashed on a Monday or Tuesday would be distilled the same week. So that would have around about a 52-hour fermentation. And that was the spirit that we would then trade with the blenders for the liquid that we require for our blend. So that would go to the one side. That would be the bulk whiskey, if you will. And then anything that was mashed on a Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday morning, it would stay in the washbacks over the weekend. And the washbacks don't care that you've gone home for the weekend. Fermentation keeps going. So that would work out at around about 105 to 110-hour fermentation. So still at the higher level. And that's the liquid that we would be using for our Tomatin single malt. So we were already running long fermentations. But then when the distillery closed down during COVID and we had to navigate reopening production, one of the really important aspects of our distillery is that most of the people live on site. We've got 30 cottages, all occupied by men and women who work at the distillery. This is their home. It's not just their job. And, I think we look back at it now and think some crazy stuff happened. But actually, back in 2020, opening up a distillery and navigating the world of COVID was not an easy thing to decide how to do. We didn't have the information we have now. And what we decided to do was allow the teams to split in two. So the brewing team would come in one week and the distillation team would come in the next week. And that allowed us to then just have this hour-long fermentation. That week-long fermentation that has been something that we've maintained since then. It didn't radically change the spirit to the point where we wouldn't be happy with consistency, but it has added that lighter, more tropical layer. Tomatin's always had this lovely sweet malty base. It's then had that orchard fruit on top of it, but now it's just got this little top note that's just like a little burst of pineapple. And so it just adds that little bit more complexity to what was already a cracking spirit.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I guess that's where we get to take this conversation to the next step and really bring it into what is your day to day. We've got amazing spirit coming off cracking stills, long ferments, putting them in amazing wood. Something that's always struck me through all of our collaborations with Tomatin is the wood program. You guys seem to access parcels of casks that just no one in the world can seem to get their hands on.
Yeah, we're pretty fortunate. I think the wood policy here at Tomatin, again, parts of it are relics of being this massive distillery in the 1970s. If we were to build Tomatin today, you probably wouldn't have a cooperage on site. It probably doesn't make too much sense from a commercial viability point of view. But we do have a cooperage on site. We're one of the very few distilleries to have that. And in fact, Alan, our cooper, just received the award for the Cooper of the Year at the Scotch Whisky, actually at the Icons of Whisky Awards. Yeah. So an incredible thing. And Alan's job is not about quantity. You know, if you go to the Speyside Cooperage, you see these guys being paid piecemeal, and they're the fastest men in the world. They're rattling casks out because they're paid for every one of them. Alan's job, he's a salary worker. His job is when the casks come in, make sure that they're of the quality that we're looking for. So physically, what do they smell like? Are they going to be great for our spirit? So we've got that kind of that safety net on site, which is Alan. We then go to the extent of maturing every single cask on site at the distillery. So we've got 13 warehouses, around about 170,000 casks at the moment, and everything is fully matured here. So we can really keep a close eye on the spirit. We can be really comfortable around the maturation conditions as well. But the cask selection is a really important part. That goes for the casks that we use in our core range, all the way through to these limited edition casks that we have. So with the casks in our core range, we have agreements in place with cooperages in Kentucky, with port houses in Portugal, with sherry producers in Spain, that allow us to control our supply of casks from, in many cases, from the construction of the cask, but in some places selecting really old wine casks. And just because of that, because of the amount of time and effort we've spent focusing on that, we just end up having conversations with people randomly, and they go, "Oh, we've got these casks. Would you be interested?" And a lot of the time, it's a case of buy now and ask for permission from the accounts team later. Myself and Graham, I think we've maybe got a little bit of a reputation for not really having foresight over a lot of the cool casks we bring in. We just know that eventually these will come good. And actually, the casks that we've used in this limited edition for the Whisky Club are a great example of that. These are casks that we just picked up over time. We knew we were going to have fun with them. We didn't know what exactly was going to come from them, but we were getting the casks offered to us that were just too good to refuse. Yeah,
it's incredible, and I guess a wonderful transition into these specific casks. And as we get into what is actually making up this whiskey, I've got a terrific question from Anthony Mickelwain here about the fact this does feature 3 types of rum casks.
Yeah.
The choice of 3 types of rum casks, Anthony wants to know, did they impart different flavors? Were each of them bringing different elements pre-whiskey going into them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's quite fun, actually, to take it back a little bit, is this whole process. I was saying beforehand how I love how this is a whiskey that is an example of a whiskey led by flavour and not narrative, but we didn't start off like that. I think at first we were looking to bottle something for the 10th anniversary of the Whisky Club, and we started working on a whiskey that was matured in a combination of tawny port casks and Portuguese red wine casks, which in the cold climate of Scotland was absolutely banging. It was a great whiskey, tasted of like spiced plum jam and stuff like that. But by the time the samples got down to you guys, the temperature, the higher temperatures, it just wasn't coming off the glass the same way.
Yeah.
And you came back to us and said, listen, I really want to do something, but we might have to pivot here and drop the story and just focus on a good whiskey. And you kind of said that for the Whisky Club, Tomatin is great fruity spirit and good fun casks. What can we do? And that's when we started looking at this parcel of rum casks that we've been collecting over the last few years, and laying spirit into and sampling them. And yeah, each rum style has a different aspect of flavour here. So to break it down, we've got 38% Guadeloupe rum casks, and they've only had a 6-month finish, which is really short for us. I know for some people 6 months is a long finish, but that is like, it's, for me, 6 months, you could have just rolled it past the rum cask, you know? You've then got 36% Barbados rum casks, and they've had a finish for 2 years and 1 month. So that's getting more into the comfort zone. But then the last 26%, quarter of the whiskey, Jamaican rum casks for over 6.5 years, which is wild. And the flavours from each is unbelievable. So Guadeloupe is this rum agricole. So it's made with the sugarcane rather than the molasses. And you get these lighter, more citrusy fruits coming in here. You get almost a vegetal character there. There's an earthiness, there's a greenness. But one of the things I remember when sampling these casks, even after only 6 months, was there was an unbelievable chocolate aroma came from the Guadeloupe rum casks. And that almost became the base note of this whiskey that everything else built around. So you don't often think of chocolate when you think of rum casks and whiskey. You always go to the fruit. But there's this lovely spiced chocolate element in the back of the palate there. The Barbados rum casks, that's where you get this lovely sweet, fruity flavour coming through. Also a little bit of spice as well. So you start to see some of the ginger and the cinnamon coming from the Barbados casks. And then finally, you've got those Jamaican rum casks. And that's where you get the funk. That's where you get that overripe banana. That, for me, as soon as I smell this, it's dried pineapple, it's dried mango. And that's all coming from the Jamaican rum casks. So all three of them really play in that fruity kind of part of the flavour wheel, but they jump off into different ranges. So with the Guadeloupe, you're moving more into that chocolatey side. With the Barbados, you're moving into the spice, and with the Jamaican, you're moving into the funk. And then you just bring the three together and layer them on top of each other, and you just get this really well-rounded expression of rum matured whiskey.
Absolutely, but I think it also harnesses what is quite uniquely Tomatin in that there is this kind of creamy, lactic, funky spirit that's got that tiny bit of like 1 ppm funk just pulling through it that just ties into all of those layers of the rum cask.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's great about these casks is that the spirit works really well in them. You, as well as getting the flavour from the cask, you can really clearly see the Tomatin characteristic, but it's almost seamless. You know, there's not, when we go back to that port cask, for example, there's the really lovely, bright, fruity Tomatin, and then there's all those port aromas on top of it. Whereas with something like this, it's just so well integrated. You don't know where the Tomatin ends and where the rum begins. And I think that's a really cool way of showing a whiskey in its natural environment.
Can I ask you a question about those port and red wine casks? Because it was heartbreaking that we couldn't quite get it together. And for members watching along, I think part of this process that we go through with so many distilleries is always incredibly exciting when all of the pieces are there. But we just, for whatever reason, they just didn't quite fit together perfectly. But there was one cask amongst them that was like this coconut bomb. It was, I think, an Esperau or something, or Symington. Do you still have that cask?
Yeah, so it's so funny because these casks have been something that, so Scott Fraser, our former colleague who worked on this behind the scenes in the early days, myself and him, we tried those casks when they were 5 years old. So these were, this was spirit that had been fully matured in these Portuguese red wine casks from Herrad de Esperau, their Reserva wine casks. And we tried them at 5 years old. You know, we're going back a few years now, and we were just sitting looking at the glass, and it was maybe the one time that myself and Scott didn't have much to say. We were just looking at the glass, tasting this whiskey, looking at the age and thinking, how on earth is this possible? This is the most It was such an expressive whiskey. And so since then, we were just waiting almost for the opportunity to come to work with them, to release them. The volume was so low that it couldn't be a massive global release. Even when we were working on them, we had to layer them in with the port casks to get enough volume for your members. But yeah, then again, we started sampling them at 10 years old with you guys, and they just got better and better. Like you say, it was almost like that coconut slice. So you've got that raspberry and coconut element. It was unbelievable. And yeah, just again, it was not the right time to use them. It was not the right climate. And I think that's a really important thing. You know, we often make whiskey in Scotland, and the only opportunity that we get to try it is in the Scottish climate. So you could be forgiven for thinking, this tastes brilliant here, everyone around the world's going to love it. What I love about working with you guys is you don't just let us run wild. You give us a lot of room to make suggestions and creativity, but you guys have the final say on the samples. We'll put together what we think are great whiskies. We'll send the samples to you, but they've got to work for your customers. They've got to work for the members of the Whisky Club. And if they don't, then it's not a good whiskey. So that's a really cool thing, to be able to kind of have that moment and say, I loved this whiskey when I was in Scotland. I love the story, but it's just not going to work. What can we do? And that's where we end up getting ultimately a product that fits so much better.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of those things, the extra effort has yielded this amazing whiskey. But I'm going to throw to the members, everyone watching along, please tell us in the comments if you want that component, that coconut slice, maybe as a single cask, maybe as a little vatting of casks. I'm not saying that Scott has to commit to it, but I am saying if enough people in the comments want those casks, maybe we'll talk about it.
Nah, Seamus, you've turned it down now. I'm keeping it as mine.
There's many years to come. I'm sure they'll still be good.
Yeah.
So we've spent some time on the spirit, we've spent some time on the cask, but I would love to spend a little bit of time on your approach to blending kind of on the whole, because when you're taking to these limited editions, and I think this is a bit of behind the scenes that the members may not always get, what's the actual philosophy to blending? Are you starting with a starting point, or are you starting with an end goal, or is it kind of evolving as it goes?
Yeah, it would be really useful if there was one rule that worked, because then it would be so much easier. But sometimes it's a case of you find great casks and you just have to turn them into a product. Sometimes you're working with the marketing team, and they want to do something. So our French, Italian, and Portuguese collections are a great example of that, where we were asked to create collections of whiskey that celebrated the wine casks of different countries. And my job was to go out and find the wine casks that we wanted to use, decide what spirit to lay down in them, decide when these casks were ready. So that was guided a little bit more by an end goal. So sometimes you start at the end and work your way back and find out how this whiskey's got to this point. Sometimes you're working at the very beginning, to the point that we're now even experimenting a lot with the new make spirit. So much of our releases over the last 10, 15 years have been cask-led. But over the last 3 or 4 years, we've been playing about with roasted barley, so chocolate malt, Carroll malt. We've been playing about with yeast strains. So we've actually got some Cabochon, which is our lightly peated whiskey, which has been fermented with Australian red wine yeast and things like that. So there's a lot of... The pipeline is full for the next 10 years of things that are not just cask-led, but are all about flavour. I think on the whole, my approach to any whiskey that we release is that it has to have a balance. And this balance isn't the same point. It's a kind of grey area, but it has to show the distillery character and it has to show the maturation character, and they have to work together. If you take Tomatin, for example, that's been fully matured for 18 years in a sherry cask, say goodbye to the Tomatin component, because Tomatin's light, it's fruity, it's vibrant. If it's been in a sherry cask for 18 years, go and buy yourself a bottle of sherry. You'll be tasting the same thing. Similarly, if you have a Tomatin that's been finished in a sherry cask for 1 month, well, what was the point in going and buying that sherry cask? You know, you've not really imparted it. So that's just an example of where we're looking for Tomatin and the cask to work together, and that's across all cask types. And I think the 14-year-old that we've got here is probably one of the finest examples of that, because it really does blur the lines between the spirit and the cask.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and I'm thrilled to spend some time on balance, because I think so often in whiskey circles we do chase kind of sherry bombs,
Yeah,
which is fun. Sherry bombs are a great time,
yeah.
but there is a world of whiskey outside of sherry bombs. Now, I will point out one thing before I jump to the next question, which is you use the word Australian. So now I have to ask all the members: the Australian wine cask yeast fermenting peated, what will become whiskey or has already become whiskey? Do we want to see that in Australia? Again, these are things that I can annoy people like Scott about constantly.
I'm really keen to work on these spirits. So that was actually 2019. We laid that down, December 2019. So it's whiskey now. What I really love about these experiments, though, is that we fill them into second and refill casks, because, again, if you filled it into a first full cask, you don't really
Yeah.
know what the impact of the yeast is, because the cask has been so dominant.
Mm.
So we're at that point now of going, right, okay, what flavour direction has the yeast taken the spirit in, and how can we then finish that in a cask that's going to really dial up into that?
So I've got an amazing question here from Corbin, and I think it's really complementary to the conversation we're having right now. So, Scott, in your opinion, what's a misconception many whiskey drinkers have about flavour development in Scotch, and how does time in a cask really influence the character beyond just age?
That's a great question, and I think it's something that it kind of frustrates me a lot. You sometimes hear producers in other climates talking about how the temperature is so much hotter, so the cask imparts flavour a lot quicker than in Scotland. I think when we think of maturation, a lot of the time we think about what does the cask add to the whiskey. But there's so much more to maturation than that. So yes, you've got the flavour of the wood and the previous contents being added into the whiskey, but you've also got where there's compounds in the wood and compounds in the spirit that interact together, and they create flavours that didn't previously exist. This is, for me, the magic of whiskey. This is where you get all your kind of esters and your tropical fruits, where an acid and an alcohol binds together to create a new flavour. You've then also got the reductive side of maturation. A lot of the time when we talk about maturation, we talk about what's been added, but equally as important is what's been removed and what's been hidden. So some of those harsher compounds that come off the still, and we're very fortunate at Tomatin that we do have a light fruity spirit, but there's still sulfury compounds in there. There's still like acrylic acids and things in there that need time in the cask to reduce and mellow. And I think that's so important. So yeah, for me, maturation is so much more than just what am I adding here. It's far more layered, it's far more complex, and you cannot speed one up at the same rate as the others. So if you do something to speed up the additive part of maturation, the reductive part doesn't speed up at the same pace. So it's a fine balance when it comes to maturation.
It's a terrific point, and I think especially coming from the Australian whiskey industry, we've probably seen it best done when the hotter climate is treated as an asset, not as a challenge that one needs to overcome, but as a consideration in all of the layers of production. This is going to come to maturation faster, or we're going to get more wood influence more quickly, but we now need to transfer it into a more neutral cask to mellow out and to stop getting so much wood influence and just mature, for example. And it's almost the opposite to a Scotch approach. There's some terrific questions. I'm trying to pick some of our winners. Lots of cast questions, unsurprisingly. A few folks, Matthew Cohen, Jake, Nigel Fuke, both asking, got any weird casks? Got any stuff you can't talk about? You got anything weird?
We've always got some weird stuff going on, particularly on the Kubokan side, because that's where we go down that really experimental route. So, over the years, we've used Japanese shochu casks, we've used Colombian oak casks and things like that. So we've not got anything that's technically illegal. So you're not going to find any Tabasco casks. You're not going to find any maple syrup casks, which is a shame because, a lot of these things, I would like to just get a cask in just to see what would happen. Not with a release in mind, but just have a little bit of fun. But we do get an opportunity to work with some really cool casks. And for me, some of the funkier ones are ones that maybe on the surface don't sound that strange. So we've got some Palo Cortado sherry casks, and people will be saying, okay, sherry casks, what's fun about that? Well, Palo Cortado is so incredibly rare. It's less than 1% of sherry in the world. And these casks have held Palo Cortado wine for over 30 years before they come to Tomatin. So it's just, we get a lot of cool things that, you know, you have to be really not just a whiskey geek, you have to be a booze geek to understand quite how special a lot of these things are.
Absolutely. Palo Cortado is a great shout. And yeah. Keen to see how that turns out. There's a terrific question here, and again, you gotta love the Australian parochial nature. But I think it's something that we talked about when we were thinking more story than we were flavour at one point of production. Have you got any Australian casks?
We don't. It's something that I'd looked into, I want to say about 5 years ago, picking up some Australian wine casks, but also like Australian tawny casks and stuff like that as well. And the kind of stumbling block that we came to is the treatment that's required to make sure the casks get here without spoiling. You know, we can get wine casks from France and from Spain to the distillery within a week. And so there's very little opportunity for the wine residue in the cask to spoil. That's not so easy when it comes to getting from Australia. The kind of main technique used is to burn a sulfur candle in the cask, but we all know what that does. One of the other solutions that was presented to us was ozoning the inside of the cask, but I've not had enough kind of feedback from other producers to give me the confidence to go and say, okay, I'm going to buy a container of these casks. So it's something that I'd love to do in time. It's something that I maybe actually need to go back to the drawing board and see how we can facilitate that. But yeah, we would definitely love to do something like that.
I think any opportunity to get Tomatin in front of more and more whiskey drinkers in Australia is a good one. And this is maybe my personal take on this. Tomatin's not a massive brand, but a really well-loved brand and a really well-loved distillery in Scotland and in big parts of Asia and big parts of Europe. It doesn't get the love it deserves here in Australia. And for whiskey geeks like the ones sat on this call and watching at home, Tomatin does everything right. It's a Highland Scotch distillery that does long finishes, does proper maturations, does long ferments, no color added, no chill filtered. All of the DNA of so many of your whiskeys are just tick, tick, tick.
Yeah.
If we can be any part of introducing what is Tomatin DNA into whiskey lovers here and whiskey lovers at the club, we're really happy to do it because the whiskey's amazing. And just looking along at the comments as they're going, I think there's a lot of love for this whiskey, for these whiskeys as well, in the audience. So I'm going to throw one question at you before I start wrapping up, Scott, which is throwing it to you now, no pressure, no commitment. If you're making a whiskey right now for an Australian audience, what do you want to make? What's the next thing on your chopping block?
That's a great question. I think for me, so you made a very good point there. It's the word underappreciated is a word that's been used to kind of talk about Tomatin a lot over the years, and it's not a word that I think fits because Tomatin's maybe not the most represented brand, but whoever opens a bottle appreciates the stuff. You know, I think the quality speaks for itself. In terms of working with something for Australia, we've had this conversation before about how for a lot of your members, peated whiskey is maybe something they shy away from a little bit in comparison to the non-peated whiskey, just in terms of that flavour profile. But I think the style of peated whiskey that we produce at Tomatin is so compelling for people that don't drink peated whiskey because it's not smoky, it's dirty, it's earthy, it's funky, it's old school, it's a bit grimy. And I just love the spirit that we're able to produce with, for 1 week a year, we use a little bit of peat and we are able to make some really, really wonderful whiskies out of that, especially when you start to get to that 10, 11, 12-year-old mark where all of the peat's pretty much gone from the spirit and you've got this wonderful cask influence. I think there's a real opportunity for us to pull something together that maybe challenges some people's perceptions of what peated whiskey can be.
Sounds like a noble challenge. Members, you'll let us know what you think of it. I'm personally a lover of Cubok and Cubok and 15 stand up incredible dram.
Yeah.
One of the best Highland whiskies going around, in my humble opinion. But it's with this that I get to start wrapping up this tasting. First and foremost, I'm not even sure if they're still on the site. I can't check right now, but there was a handful of bottles available of this, just for us watching along in the tasting. So members, while you're watching along, if you want to grab a top up, or if you were silly enough to miss out, please make the most of that opportunity. For everyone else watching along, I want to say an enormous cheers for having a dram with Scott and I. It's been great to get an amazing behind the scenes at the distilling process. And for the members watching along, Corbin Ether, you are the lucky winner who has been watching and asking some terrific questions. So the next month's Whiskey of the Month is on you. But if you would join me, Scott, in raising a massive cheers to all the members watching along, I would love that.
Yeah, thank you so much, guys, for all your support of Tomatin. It means a lot. Slanjava.
Slanjava, and members, join me in cheersing Scott as well. Thank you for joining us.